G'day everyone, Kate here from the Narrate team. This weekend, Adam talks to us about the value of being safe and approachable. Adam looks in depth at great examples that Jesus gives us in the Gospels of being quick to listen and slow to speak.
So, happy Father's Day. I'm just going to admit to you, I'm a little bit distracted on this Father's Day because my 9-year-old is in an all-star tournament that the game was at 10 o'clock, and so I just going to read you I was singing, but I was also reading my text messages from my friend Steve, who, this is shameless bragging, but I'm gonna read it. He texted me somewhere around the first song, was tied, bases loaded, Hushka drives in 3. Yeah. And then he texts me, need 1 out. Then he texts me, 2 on, 2 out. Then he texts me, Helena wins. So it's kind of fun. Some redemption to missing all of those. So it's great to be with you, and happy Father's Day. I guess where I want to start this morning is I think probably most of you can relate to this as a father, that this is a day that's about us in some regard. It's about fatherhood. It's about celebration. And yet I wonder if your experience of fatherhood or this day is kind of like mine, where it's also the day where you feel like the biggest imposter of the entire year. Like there's this, if we're not careful, shameful irony that comes with it, where you arrive at this day where you're celebrated as a dad, and yet I just don't know a dad who feels like they were a good one. And that's hopefully not self-loathing to the furthest extreme, and I don't mean it as false humility, but there's this sense, isn't there, that like father being a father, I don't know what word I'm looking for. Really all I can think about is Helena wins. There's something ironic about it, isn't there? That on the one hand, you're being celebrated, on the other hand, there's this mountain of memories and inadequacies and things you could have done better and things you wish you could do over. And even my friends who are anticipating being a father, I already hear it coming from their mouth, where there's this sense of failure before the project has even begun. And so I guess this morning, quite honestly, the way I prepare for Father's Day is throughout my year and life, I'm constantly trying to learn and grow just like you are. And so I have a running list in Evernote of all my inadequacies as a father. And so then what happens is several months before Father's Day, I pick the most glaring one and I decide to write a sermon on it. And that's not false. So there's this sense of like, what am I working on? What am I working on? And the thing that I've been working on, and the first Evernote entry I can find in my stuff goes all the way back to early February. And really, I think the question that kicks it all off is this question of how important is it to you, dads, and I trust that you can apply this no matter where you're at, but how important is it to you that approachability is a part of your character? Like, how important is it to you that when someone screws up, when the car is wrecked, when the check isn't mailed, when the grade is an F, when there's failure of the most shocking kind, perhaps, how important is it to you that in that moment you're a safe person? That in that moment you're not the last person to be called, but maybe the first or the second? And then when there's a problem to be solved, whether the problem is a flat tire or getting kicked out of the dorms or a bad grade or a girlfriend or boyfriend issue, how important is it to you that when there's a problem to be solved, they come to you? And are you aware that the way you behave relationally sets the stage for that? And the other thing that I think we may be well served to think about is, are you aware, and do you actively live in light of this reality that when someone has a problem to be solved, again, whether it's a flat tire or something relational, that competency is only part of the equation we use to decide whether or not we're going to them, isn't it? That the competency is part of it, but there's, you need somebody who's actually changed a tire before. You need somebody who you think has a chance to have your answer, but there's more to it than that, isn't there? Don't you know extraordinarily competent people who you wouldn't dare go to in those most grave of situations? What is the rest of the formula? Isn't it, in a very real sense, approachability? That the type of person that failure, it's not accepted, but it's expected, that it's anticipated and that the relationship is safe even after it happens? Or how about when there's disagreement, say on matters of faith or politics, on a social issue, on values or on a moral decision? How important is it to you that when someone disagrees with your belief system or your value system, when a son or a daughter takes a few steps away from it, How important is it to you that you maintain a safe person in that context? You know, I can't remember what prompted this whole discussion in me and what kind of awakened it. I probably should have been awakened to it 36 years ago, because it's not lost on me the more I think about it that in many ways and in many contexts I'm not approachable. And especially I had a gal come up to me after the first service and go, no, you're very approachable. And I went, yeah, that's the whole point. Here, easy. I control this. Home with my kids, extraordinarily difficult. And in a marriage relationship, very, very difficult. So I'm not sure what awakened me to it, though I should have been awakened to it many, many years ago. But I think it may have had something to do with a conversation that I had with my friend Dick Savage. Dick lives in Colorado. He is a retired therapist. He has PhD level degrees in both psychology and theology. And we were talking on the phone several months ago around this February time. And I don't know how we got on it, but Dick raised 3 sons. And somehow we got on this topic, and he was sharing with me that when his sons reached middle school, and all the more when they got into high school, he said his number one goal was that they would understand that his number one goal was to understand them. And I said, what do you mean by that? I never even thought in these terms. And he said, I wanted my boys to know that even if they made a decision that I disagreed with, even if they did something extraordinarily stupid, even if they strayed a long ways from my value system and the value systems of my faith, I wanted them to know that even if we were going to disagree on what they did, that it was important to me that I understood how they got there and why they decided that and why were they going this different direction than me. And I said, why was that so important to you? And then he used a set of words that are both motivating and haunting to me. He said, because Adam, I know as a therapist, as someone who's done this work, as a person who's been alive for a while, I know that when a person in a relationship goes underground, it's almost impossible to get them back to the surface. And I said, what do you mean by that phrase underground? He said, I know that when a person determines that I'm not safe to disagree with, I'm not safe to make a mistake in front of, I'm not a safe person to confide in a problem, I know that when a person decides that I'm not safe, it's not that they stop doing or believing that, but what happens is they take that belief and that value and those decisions and they go underground with them. And he said this, and this was the part that haunts me. He said, and I know that statistically speaking, when a person in a relationship goes underground, it is almost, if not entirely, impossible to get them back to the surface. Now, as I say that, I'm guessing you can already think of relationships, whether consciously or subconsciously, somewhere back there, you went underground. Marriages end because of this. Emotional connection ends because of this. We have phrases like there's this weird wall or there's distance. And I guess, and I know it's a little bit of a thud after following something so funny, but what I respect about the men and fathers of this place is it's not the type of people you're not who just go like, hey, let's just pat each other on the backs and say, good job, Dad. You want to grow. We want to grow. It's what makes us us. And I guess the question that I want to ask this morning is, do you have a habit of shoving people underground? Are there quirks within your relational style that knowingly or unknowingly causes people to deem that you're not safe? You know, one of the other things that Dick Savage said to me, and this probably won't surprise you, but it needs to be said, is he said, Adam, in all my experience, what it tells me is that church people and church parents are millions times more prone to this than are the rest. That we spend a lifetime developing these convictions and beliefs and values. We form our entire social structure around it. And therefore, when someone disagrees with it, when someone seems to deviate from it at all, we force the relationship underground. And so as I've been wrestling with this and the degree to which you are, I find myself asking this question of, okay, I'm a Christ follower. And some of you are and some of you aren't, and that's fine. We totally respect that. But what I love about Jesus is whether you believe that he was on the cross and then was alive again or not, there's really no denying that a more beautiful human existence has never been had. That even if you don't want to talk about his divinity, that the standard and the tone and the things that he taught are undeniably beautiful and good. And when you peruse the Gospels for this, okay, so what does it look like to be approachable? It actually gets a little overwhelming because it becomes this study and like, okay, what text don't I use Because over and over and over again, he demonstrates this high level of approachability. But for whatever reason, the particular relationship that stands out the most to me is the one he had with his right-hand guy, his first lieutenant, his heir apparent. It doesn't seem that this guy was the guy who he was most emotionally connected to, but he was the guy that he had confided in the most in terms of the movement. He was the guy that he trusted. If someone needed to change the lug nuts with their teeth, he'd be willing to do it. And his name was Peter. And even Peter, he assumed those reins. He acted first, he thought later. That was the role that he had. In that era of sheep herding, the lead sheep has a bell on. The rest of them follow him. That was Peter in the text. He was the one that had to go first. And you may remember that Peter said to the guys at one point, he said to Jesus, hey, I know there's 12 of us, but if there only ends up being one, that one will be me. And if the other 11 run, I'm not running. I'll die for you. But then you hit the fast forward button and you find yourself in the eve of Jesus' most difficult day. He knew what was coming. We know from the words he used, he knew what was involved, both spiritually and physically. And he retired to his favorite chair. But in his case, it wasn't a chair, it was an olive grove. He went into Gethsemane, this house of this olive grove, a wine press would have been there, which there's all kinds of metaphors for that. And he asked Peter and a couple other guys but one thing. What do you say? Hey, Peter, would you pray for me? And Peter, not once but twice, did what while he was being asked to pray for Jesus? He fell asleep. A little bit later, the guys came to arrest Jesus. And Peter, while he initially pulled out a sword and was ready to be all tough, there's this very ominous sentence in the text. It just simply says, and then all the disciples fled, and they were gone. A few hours later, perhaps, Jesus was going through this mock trial. It was an embarrassment to the entire country, not to mention Jesus, as this former high priest was behaving as though he had authority that he really didn't even have at this point. And Peter made his way in there, and he was listening to the trial. And one of the people who was also listening to the trial turned to Peter and said, hey, aren't you one of them? To which Peter said, but he denied it before them all. I don't know who you're talking about, he said. Peter got nervous, as any of us would. He withdrew a little bit. The text says he moved under an archway. I think that it was at that point where you kind of want to know who's behind you at this point. And another woman said to him, hey, aren't you one of them? And the text says he denied it again, but this time with an oath. I don't know the man. In other words, I swear to God, on my mother's grave, I don't know who you're talking about. I'm with you. I'm here to observe this trial. A little bit later, another woman says to him, hey, wait a minute. You sound funny. You talk different. I think you're from Wisconsin. And Peter, the text says, then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know the man. Now, some of your older texts, if you go look at it, it'll actually say, then he began to call down curses on himself. That phrase on himself isn't in the Greek language, but for decades, as scholars were trying to understand what exactly Peter did here, they took the interpretive leap that he was calling down curses on himself. More recently, that's been removed in the latest NIV because, it's not in the Greek. And what a more thorough word study is showing is that the verb there that he's using was almost always in the text used to point to another. In other words, in this case, Peter doesn't just swear he didn't know him. He doesn't just deny knowing him. In this case, he called down curses on Jesus. Excuse the language, but he's more or less saying at this point, screw Jesus. Like, that's why I'm here. I want to see him dead. He's sullying this whole movement. He should die. He's a fake. He's a phony. He's an imposter. He's ruining Israel. And in that moment, Luke's account picks up. And the text in this, I think, deep drama says in that moment, and reading from Luke 22:61, listen to this. It says, the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. I think you want to know whether or not Jesus was accountable, you need to know the answer to one question. What was the look on Jesus' face in that moment? Right? Because you've given the look and you've seen the look. And us men in particular, we can move mountains without saying a word, can't we? With just a glance. Suddenly the kids are leaving the room. Suddenly the behavior's toned down. With just a glance, we can say a ton, can't we? I don't know if we get to play that silly game in heaven of like, hey, God, would you answer this Trivial Pursuit question for me? But wouldn't you love to know what the look on Jesus' face was in that instance? Now, of course, we don't get to know. The text doesn't tell us, but it does offer some clues, because what happens from there, at the risk of trivializing the most important facts in history, in my opinion, as a Christ follower, the risk of trivializing all that, Jesus dies, he's resurrected. The movement that was dead is then founded upon not an idea, but a historical moment. They're trying to figure out, like, wait a minute, we thought our movement was over, now it's here again. Jesus is here, he's in the body, and they were doing what you and I would do. Like, wait a minute, that doesn't happen. What does this mean? And in the instance and in the pain of all that, in the turmoil and the confusion and the wrestling and of all that, the guys went fishing. Things haven't changed all that much, have they? And as they're fishing, the text says that a mysterious guy shows up on the shore. Nobody knows who he is. And he yells out to this boat of fishermen, "Hey, have you caught any fish?" And they yell, "No, and we never do. That's why we don't buy a license." And then he yells, "Throw your nets over on the other side." And in that instance, John, the text says, he thinks, "Throw your nets over on the other side, throw your nets." I know, I sang that song when I was growing up. That's Jesus. And John turns to Peter, and he says to him, that you find this whole account in chapter 21. It says, "Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, 'It is the Lord.' And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say it, 'It is the Lord,' he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off." We'll save that conversation for later. "And he jumped into the water." You want to know whether or not Jesus was approachable? You know what you need to know? Don't you need to know what direction Peter was swimming? Because if I'm Jesus, and that guy who's done all that to me has just jumped in the water, I'm going to assume he's swimming the opposite direction, aren't you? Like, if God is the type of character, probably many of us, and especially those who are completely disillusioned with Jesus in the church, if his character is what most of us think that it is, wouldn't you expect Peter, in the midst of all of his failure and all of his shame and all of his mistakes and all of the turmoil and all of the pain he had caused and all the betrayal, wouldn't you expect that he was jumping into the lake to swim to the Greek side of the lake because he needed to find a new life because he had been completely excommunicated from this Jewish world? And yet, if you want a picture of approachability, I think you look no further than the fact that Peter didn't jump into the water to get further from Jesus. Despite all he had done, he jumped into the water to swim toward Jesus. The alternative was to stay in the boat and arrive maybe a minute later, and he couldn't take that. He was so wanting to get to Jesus' side and have a barbecue with him. And so I asked the question, dads, in the midst of that kind of betrayal and those types of mistakes and that kind of abandonment of the family values and that kind of carnage and that kind of poor spending and those kinds of grades and whatever blank you want to fill in the midst of that, do those that you love the most swim toward you or away from you? Is the way that you go about relationships to shove it underground or to keep it above? And dare I say that if you are of the privileged position of having a dad who keeps it above the surface, who you know in the midst of your deepest mistake, you can swim toward them, I want to argue that the best gift you can give your dad today is to affirm that in him. Don't blow smoke, because that's not what he wants. But if you're among the rare ones that go like, "That's my dad," he'll love the card and enjoy the dinner, but nothing would mean more to him than that. Are you the type that causes people to draw near in the midst of the worst stuff? You know, as you begin to ask the question then of what would it mean for me to become more approachable? And I don't think this is a thing that we have to get caught up and beat ourselves up over. This is a growth thing. This is a life thing. But I guess the question then becomes, and the only thing different between me and you is I'm a few days ahead of you on thinking about this, what does it mean? What are the character attributes of an approachable person? And here too, I turn to one of my favorite narratives in the New Testament. We find it in John chapter 8. And if you're someone who's familiar with Narrate, we use this story so much. But let me just remind you before we jump in, the Jews say that the text is like an incredibly complex crystal, that when you hold it into the sunlight, if you turn it just 1 degree, it refracts the light differently. And with John 8, I think we've spent so much time talking about 100% grace and 100% truth, but I think John 8 tells us a brilliant story about what makes a person approachable. Now, the story, for those of you that don't remember or aren't familiar, is that this woman is caught in the act of adultery. These religious leaders who are anti-Jesus, they catch her in the act of adultery. Never mind that they caught a man too, but we're not going to talk about that. They're not either. They bring this woman to Jesus, and what they've done is they've baited a trap, because what the Jewish law says is a woman caught in an act of adultery should be stoned to death. But the Romans had already one-upped that and taken away from the Jews the right to inflict capital punishment. And so they had Jesus trapped. If he says kill her, then the Romans are going to arrest him because Caesar won't like that. And if he says don't do anything to her, then they can prove him to be a religious heretic and betraying the Jewish law. Remember what Jesus does? He just stoops in the dirt and plays. I don't know what he does. But functionally, what is he doing? Breathing? Buying time? Choosing that the best thing he can do in this moment is say nothing? I wonder if approachable people are first and foremost slow to speak. Do your own little study. Create a list of people that you find approachable and figure out why. And I dare you, but I'll bet what you'll find is first and foremost, they listen. James and I had this brilliant conversation on Thursday, and I can't wait. We're gonna be able to unpack so much more from what he's doing and the expertise he has. But first and foremost, improv comedy is about the ability to listen. You would think a comedian is funny because they talk, but talking comes secondary to listening. Did you see that? You know, James was Jesus' half-brother and an author of a New Testament book. And he said a statement to a group of people who were at each other's throat constantly. In James 1:19, he said these simple but poignant words. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak. And what's the promise? And you'll be slow to be angry. What is approachability but the ability to control your emotions and not allow your anger to park on somebody else? What if the promise here, and in fact, I've wondered if, I feel like this is the principle of the narrative of John 8. I feel like James watched his brother, and over a lifetime, and after reconciling him to be the Son of God as well as his earthly brother, I feel like James went like, wait a minute. You want to know what I learned from my brother? Just be quick to listen and slow to speak, and you'll be amazed of what comes from that. My wife is the most approachable person I know. Brings good balance to our home because I'm the most unapproachable person perhaps that she knows at times. But what I've watched her do, and the phrase that I've used, she's never used it, but the phrase that I used of her is she's the queen of circling back to something. And what I mean by that is the boys come home from school and they're telling a story and they're saying these things and they're talking about what them and their friends were doing. And I hear something that I don't like and I pounce. Right, like, stop the car, we're getting out, we got to talk about this right now. She has the ability to make mental note of, wait a minute, I don't really like the way they were saying that they were talking to one another there, but I'm not going to say it right now because the win right now is they're actually confiding in me and sharing and being honest. And she'll have the ability to hold that information. I've seen her do it for weeks. And it could be a couple weeks later when they're driving to the grocery store and the moment seems right, and then she'll go, hey, remember a couple weeks ago when you're telling about your friends? Yeah, that was so funny, and oh, that was so great. And she'll go, but have you ever thought about like how that made that kid feel when you said that? Not an instant shutdown, but a circling back days later. I've watched her do this where one will come home from a friend's house and he'll be talking about how excited he is about this new app that he downloaded onto his iPod Touch and blah, 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 blah. He's going on and on and on. And I'm going like, I don't like that app. Like, get rid of that app. End of conversation. She has the ability to go, I don't like that app. And tonight, when I'm tucking him in, I think I'll just ask him like, hey, do you think that's a healthy app to have on your phone? What if approachability is about the ability to listen, to speak later, to carry a catalog, and to bring it back up later if necessary? See, our approachable people, sometimes it's a disadvantage to be at the 11:30 because I'm off my script. I was walking home after kind of an arduous week of working in a particular circumstance where there were people from all kinds of social and religious lines, and that we got the chance to serve them. And I saw on this car this bumper sticker that said coexist. And I thought to myself, I couldn't agree more. That's what I've given my life to. And yet I was deeply emotionally offended by the shallowness of the statement. Because I thought that is such an easy claim to make. and so extraordinarily difficult to actually live out, isn't it? Because we live in this culture that values acceptance. And listen, if you know anything about Narrate, you know it's how we roll. But how do we not confuse that with being a person without any convictions whatsoever? That's the crux of this conversation, isn't it? How do I maintain being approachable while also maintaining being the kind of person who has values and is willing, when appropriate, to speak to them and not jump on soapboxes, but at the same time stand and walk with Christ? And none of you needs me telling you that the mistake that is so easy to make as a Christ follower and a community of Christ followers is to somehow stand for something and become entirely unapproachable. What if approachable people, they listen first? And the second thing that stands out to me is this question of what if approachable people are masters at asking questions? Like, what if they have the ability to summarize an entire diatribe, an entire lecture in a question? See, listen, I'm sure you've observed this, but in the School of Redundancy School, let's just look at it again. Because in John chapter 8, when Jesus finally speaks, what does he say? He says, let any of you who's without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. Now, he's not asking a question technically there. I'm going to argue functionally he was asking a question because he just activated in their heads, those religious people, did he activate the gears that say, believe this because he said it, or did he activate the gears that say, hey, think about this? He caused them to begin to think. And when they finally dissipated and realized that they were way out of line and that maybe Jesus had just caught them in their own religious idealism, fundamentalism perhaps, he finally looks at her and what does he say to her? Does he say, you're a sinner and you're going to hell? Does he say there's no such thing as sin? God just loves you because you're his? No, he asks her a question. Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? I found myself this week in this particular tussle, and it was the type, you know, when you become the master of the bullet point, and you can make your point, and it's like, what-ah? And text messages make it so much better, right? Because you can formulate the perfect words and send it off and just go like, conversation over, I hit send, match that. And when it was all done, and the relationship was mostly in tatters, and I was laying in bed that night, I thought, Adam, all you had to do was ask a question. Because the facts were on your side. You had a good point to make. And had you asked a question, you would have invited a conversation. But instead, you gave them the enviable privilege of either acknowledging that you're the most brilliant person in the world or not. Dan Pink has this remarkable statement. I encourage you to listen to every TED podcast you can find of his and read his books. He has this brilliant statement where he says, the research shows that when the facts are on your side, questions are more effective than statements. Why does Jesus ask so many questions? Why was Jesus so approachable? Why does Jesus ask so many questions? Why do you see? Around and around and around we go. There's this game I've been playing, and I've been starting my days doing this, and I don't do it every day, but man, I've been trying hard since February as I became consciously aware of my incompetence. You know, we did this conversation in this last winter where we talked about gratitude. And so like many of you, I'm trying to start my day by just acknowledging 5 to 10 things from the previous day that I ought to be thankful to God for. It pops the bubble of self-absorption. But the next layer that I've added to that, and I've literally on some days kept a tally throughout the day because I'm competitive and I like it when I can figure out a way to compete against myself. And the tally is just number of opportunities I had to be approachable and how did I do? And I'll just start the morning and go, okay, Lord, help me think through the day and the interactions I had with people and the emails that I received and the emails I sent and the conversations I had with the boys. When was I given the chance to be approachable? And how did I do with that? What if dads, what if you could do what is statistically so improbable? And you could form a relationship with your son and your daughter that stays above the surface. And that whether navigating a divorce, whether navigating a decision that they made that they're so incredibly ashamed of, whether navigating the worst, or just something trivial like a C on a test, what if the first person that they want to turn to is you? And they want to do that because they know that you have embodied grace and truth, that you're a brilliant listener, and that you won't allow your competence to override your desire to understand them. And what if, as you try to reconcile Jesus and who he is, and you've long ago concluded that he just wouldn't want anything to do with you because of what you've done, what if you've got it wrong? What if Jesus has this remarkable ability to, on the one hand, have this unspeakably spotless, perfect view of the goal? And at the same time, what if you've misunderstood Jesus and misunderstood his character in the sense that in the midst of what you're most embarrassed by, he welcomes you back? You know, I'm not here to tell anyone what to believe about Jesus, but to provoke thought. What we know is that nobody's born a Christ follower. But we also know there's a difference between being an admirer of Jesus and a follower. You could admire him and applaud him and sing his songs, and that's great. And you can follow him. And that's something completely different. And before you choose not to follow him, I guess my invitation to you is not simply to ascribe yourself to what I'm saying, but open up the Gospels, read Matthew, read Mark, read Luke, or read John, and see if the Jesus you don't believe in is the same as the one that represents himself in the Gospels. Because I think what you'll find is a God who in an unspeakable fashion has the ability to embrace grace and truth. And something about him will cause you at the exact same time to want to acknowledge your imperfections, but draw closer to him, not feel pushed further from him. Let's pray. God, Lord, I'm guessing that the person in the room who feels that they've got this approachability thing nailed is few and far between. And so, God, we collectively as a church, as a people, journeying toward you, and some of us following you and some of us contemplating it, God, we confess to you the myriad ways that we make ourselves unapproachable. And God, we ask that you would give us the wisdom to see those moments when we're getting to choose between approachable or unapproachable. And the courage, God, to what in many ways amounts to just releasing control and choosing to first and foremost listen. First and foremost, make sure we're not making fear-based decisions. To first and foremost, value the relationship staying above the surface. God, for new dads, for anticipating dads, God, would you give them the types of people in their life who could model what it looks like to be approachable? God, for dads of students and even dads whose home is like they're not there anymore. Would you just give them little snapshots of ways that they could demonstrate to their students and adult kids that they want to be a safe place, that you're turning the tide of their heart. We love you, Jesus. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.